Good day, friends. On 30th of October, President Trump wrote on his social media that I have instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis because other countries are testing their programs. Later, when talking to a channel, Trump named the countries also which are testing, and he said they are Russia, China, North Korea, and Pakistan. However, Trump refused to make a very clear cut distinction between nuclear testing and testing of systems used for the delivery of nuclear weapons. The two things are entirely different. Yet the fact remains that when President of America talks about nuclear testing, the whole world sits up. And since he has mentioned three countries, Russia, China, and Pakistan, which are of great interest to India, I am doing this video so that I'm able to put what Trump has said about nuclear testing into some perspective. Now, when we talk of nuclear testing or nuclear issues, then we go back to the fundamentals, the basics, and we know that the nuclear theology maximum, it came out during the Cold War. Because this was the time in the Cold War that there were two nuclear superpowers, the Americans and the Soviets. So what I have done is I have picked up two themes or two ideas from this nuclear theology which are relevant to my discussion and relevant to modern war, and that is what I'll discuss. The first one is I'll talk about the connect between a conventional war and a nuclear war. And then I will talk about the concept of nuclear deterrence, which was dissimilar between the Americans and the Soviets. So let me start with the first one, which is what is the connection between a conventional war and the nuclear war? How should we understand that? Now we know the Cold War started in 1945, and by 1950s the Americans realized that the Soviets had large numbers of conventional forces, much bigger than the American forces. They had more tanks, more aircraft, more guns, more of everything. Though in terms of technology, they were not at par with the Americans, but the fact remains that large quantities have a quality of its own. So this imbalance which had come on the battlefield, that needed to be corrected, and the Americans needed to offset the advantage of the Soviets in the conventional forces. So what to do? President Eisenhower was given two options. One was that let's match the capabilities, conventional capabilities of the Soviets. He rejected this option. The second option was entirely different, which was thought through by the American strategist of the time. And that was that when it comes to big bombs, which is the strategic nuclear weapons which can wipe out cities, America had far more numbers than the Soviets. Now, this was the reality, and therefore the American strategists suggested let's introduce tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. Tactical nuclear weapons are weapons with low yields. The whole idea was that these tactical nuclear weapons, on the one hand, they will stop the conventional forces offensive of the Soviet Union well before it comes to the front line. And on the other hand, because the Soviets did not have as many big bombs as the Americans had, the Soviet will not get into a nuclear war because the escalation will happen. And they will not be able to match the numbers of the Americans in the big bombs. Now, this was a weird logic, but for whatever reason, it was never put to test. So this was America's first offset strategy, which was the introduction of nuclear weapons on the battlefield. Next, what happened was that by the 1970s, the Americans once again realized that the battlefield situation had changed. Now the Soviets had as many big bombs as the Americans. They had as many tactical nuclear weapons as the Americans, and they still had large conventional forces, but in certain key technologies, now their conventional forces were at par with the Americans. So once again, they had an advantage, and that needed to be offset. And that first offset strategy has run its course, because now the Soviets had big bombs like the Americans had the numbers. So something else needed to be done. So the Americans said, all right, tactical nuclear weapons won't work. Now let us look at using non nuclear capabilities at long ranges with precision, non nuclear capabilities. And when we use this, then we can stop the offensive of the Soviet Union conventional forces in the tracks before it comes to the front line. And this was called the second offset strategy. Of course, it was never tested by the Americans against the Soviets, but this was tested by the Americans against Iraq in the 1991 Gulf War, which the world said was a new war. It was a war about shock and awe. Because for the first time, the Americans had revealed something entirely different, a combination of battle networks, space capabilities, and PGMs, which is the precision guided munition. Now, the lesson that came out from the first and the second offset strategy was rather simple, that when it comes to conventional war and nuclear war, credible deterrence has to be built separately. You need credible conventional deterrence and you need credible nuclear deterrence. One does not support the other. This lesson even holds true today. It has not changed. You need separate, credible deterrence for both. Now, let me talk about the other thing that I said, the nuclear deterrence concept. Now, before I discuss this, there is a bit of a background that needs to be understood. Now, as far as the Soviets were concerned, they had theorists, military theorists, and the job of the military theorist was to come up with ideas about warfare. Because the thinking was that the generals, the military leadership, they are caught so much in their day-to-day affairs that they do not have the time to think and work out all these things. So ideas have to be given to them on the platter, and based on the ideas which are given to them, then they can work out the war concepts to optimize their chances of winning the war. So there were military theorists and there were the strategists, the military strategist. Now this word strategy comes from the Greek word which is art of the general. So the job of the Soviet general staff was to take these ideas and make it into war concept. Unlike the Americans did not have the military theorist. They only had the strategist. And as far as the American strategies were concerned, they were very clear that when we look at the battlefield, there are only two things. There is tactics and there is strategy. Strategy is what happens at the highest level where the military and the political leadership interact with one another. Everything else is tactics for the Americans. That means, as far as the Americans are concerned, even at the lowest level, which is at the front line, the junior leaders should have a sense of art of maneuver because they are involved in it. Now, as far as the military theorists of the Soviets were concerned, they said, no, we do not accept these two levels only. They said, yes, tactics is what is the front line, but when you go deep inside, the situation changes. So why not have capabilities and techniques which can hit non-nuclear, all of them, which can hit at the depth. So they said at the depth what will happen is that let's call that the operational level of war. So the point to make is that it was the Soviet theorist, military theorist, who came up with this idea of the operational level of war. And after that, this was tested in the Second World War by the military strategists, the general staff of the Soviet Union, and this was found to be good. It was found to be credible. So, operational level of war has been contributed by the Soviets. And for the first time that the Americans made mention, after watching very closely the Soviets, they made a mention in their field manual of 1982, which was on air-land battle. But somehow They never completely adopted the operational level of war. They still talk in terms of tactics and they talk in terms of strategy. So now the point is, once we understand the contribution of the Soviets about this operational level of war, now let's look at the conventional and the nuclear war. When we look at the conventional war, as far as the Americans are concerned, like I said, they gave a lot of importance to tactics right from the front line. But for the Soviets, tactics is a side issue. Because for them, the art of maneuver or the art of the general has to happen at the operational level of war in deep depth. And as I said, they want to do that. They did it with non-nuclear capabilities and techniques. So there were four of them, and it was a combination of four things that the Soviet Union, their general staff, they worked on for the operational level of war. And they were the vertical troop strikes. Now, this was about the air mobile forces. And we know air mobile forces are airborne forces and air assault forces. The point to make is that in terms of air mobile forces, the Soviet Union had far more than the Americans had because of this concept. The second thing was integrated fire strikes. You integrate the fire strikes of the aircraft, of the missiles, and of the artillery. That was done. Then the Soviets had operational maneuver groups. Now they were those small, handleable groups, entities, structural entities, a little more than a brigade. The whole idea was that they had to move fast. You just cut through the front line and you immediately rush towards the depth. That was the job of the operational maneuver group. And of course, it was not very easy because there was difficulties about logistics, there were difficulties about command and control, there were difficulties about integral air defense. But those beside this concept, as far as the Soviets were concerned, they were happy with it. And the fourth element was their special forces working behind the enemy lines. Now let's look at this concept of operational level of war with all these capabilities and how it worked for the Soviets at both on the conventional battlefield as well as the nuclear battlefield. You see, as far as the conventional battlefield was concerned, what this meant was the operational level of war. That if you hit operational depths, if you strike there, then the entire defense of the enemy unravels. That is the advantage. And when you look at the nuclear war, you see the Americans were still talking about a limited nuclear war based on the tactical nuclear weapons. As I said, their thinking was that it is possible to stop a nuclear war. You can limit it. You can control the escalation. Now, the Soviets did not believe in this at all. As far as the Soviets were concerned, they were very clear that if you bring in nuclear weapons, whatever yield, tactical or strategic, well, you cannot control the escalation at all. It's not possible. Therefore, they thought of this concept of using the non-nuclear capabilities and techniques which can give a similar result as a tactical nuclear weapon at the operational level of war, which is what I spoke about. So, in other words, the benefit of the operational level of war was there at the conventional level. It was also there at the nuclear level because a new extra layer had been added. Extra layer of non-nuclear capabilities at the operational level between a conventional war, the tactics of the Americans, and the nuclear war. So, as I have argued also in my first book, which came out 25 years ago, that the operational level of war, the intermediate level of war is the most important. This is where the result of a campaign is determined, not at the tactics, not at the battles. So, this was actually introduced by the Soviets in the 1920s. And it has stood the test of time. Now, why I say stood the test of time is that it is at this level, operational level, where you create an extra layer, as I said, a non-nuclear layer. Now let's talk about the present Russia, because after all the thinking of the Soviet Union, it came down to the Russians. And then from the Russians and the Soviets, plenty of thinking and war concepts the PLA also picked up. And of course, they had their own thinking also. And I will come a little later to explain as to how the Pakistan military, because it keeps interacting so much with the PLA, they've also picked up ideas from there. Now, coming to President Putin has recently announced a lot of new capabilities. In very brief, those capabilities are avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle, which will be put on the ICBM, and this has a speed of Mach 27. It's basically a glide vehicle. That means this will operate at the near space. Near space is what is there between the altitude of 20 kilometers and 100 kilometers, because beyond 100 kilometers is space. So this is where a new layer has been added. And similarly, they have this Zircon, which is their hypersonic cruise missile, Mach 9 speed, and based on their, which has the scramjet engine. So it is there. This also will operate in this hypersonic space that I just mentioned about. So this is that extra layer of conventional capability that has been added. And of course, he also spoke about the Poseidon nuclear powered drone, and he spoke about that Poseidon it is said that this will go to the depth of 1000 meters in the sea, because this is a underwater drone. And mind you, when we talk of the depth, we are basically always talking of about 300 meters. So here we are talking about 1000 meters, well deep inside. Then he also, President Putin mentioned Bruce sorry my pronunciation, which is the nuclear powered cruise missile. And this was tested at the range of 14,000 kilometers over a period of 15 hours. And this has a nuclear powered propulsion. Of course, this was tested and the test was successful. So in both the cases of the Poseidon, it was the nuclear powered propulsion, which means this has added to the strategic capabilities of Russia. And President Putin said that this will be the strategic capability for the 21st century. So mind you, there are more capabilities, but the Russians now have added that, as I said, let me repeat, at the hypersonic altitudes. Now they have the conventional weapons, and then they have the strategic weapons with nuclear warheads. Now, PLA has done a similar thing. PLA also, we know it has credible hypersonic glide vehicle and credible hypersonic cruise missiles. And on top of that, they did a successful test of FOBS, which is Fractional Orbital Bombardment System. This was done in August 2021, and what this was about is that using a rocket, a hypersonic glide vehicle was lifted. It went out of the space into the low Earth orbit, about 150 kilometers, and then re-entered the Earth, from where it could hit at any place on the Earth. So the point to make is, by the demonstration of FOB, which at that time the top American general Mark Milley, he called this a near Sputnik movement. So what they demonstrated was that instead of a triad delivery system, which is a normal thing, when we talk of a triad, we talk of a air delivery system, land delivery system, the missiles, and we talk of the sea. They added one more. So it became a quad. Now they were talking of FOBs. So the point that I am making is that both these countries have learned this lesson. So it is relevant as far as the two great powers are concerned, which is Russia and China. Now I want to come to India and Pakistan, because Pakistan has been mentioned by President Trump. Now let's understand this. You see, both India and Pakistan, I have said this repeatedly, they have similar doctrines. So they both had the concept, the American concept or the British concept, the NATO concept of tactics and strategy. That is all they had. So you either are doing strategy or you're doing tactics, and that is how they have fought the wars. For example, the first war was fought, the first war of Kashmir, where the Pakistani army realized that in terms of numbers, they were well short of the Indian army. So we know they used the irregulars in the first war. And after that, on 1st of January 1948, the ISI was created, and one of the key jobs of the ISI was to use the irregulars and make up the shortage of numbers against the Indian army. And then we know they did the nuclear test immediately after India's nuclear test in May 1998. And that was meant to maintain the balance at the strategic level of war. Now, as far as the as far as the numbers were concerned, now the numbers were matched. I call this the operational level of war. I don't think that in the Pakistani military literature they were using this word really. But what I believe in is that at the operational level of war, the Pakistanis were able to match the Indian military, and there are two evidence of that why I say this. The first is, in all the wars that they fought, 65 war, 71 war, the first military line which was created on 1st of January 1949, which was called the ceasefire line, that military line still exists on the ground. Which means that they matched at the operational level of war, which I say is the war winning at the campaign level. Which is why the Indian military was unable to obliterate that line, and only the name of the line changed. From ceasefire line after the 1971 war, it came to be called as the line of control. And the other reason is that since 1991, the Pakistan army has been doing proxy war in Jammu and Kashmir. And the reason for that is very simple, that they are confident that they have the capability. In case India does go to war, they can take on India. India has not been able to build the credible conventional capabilities, and they think that they match the Indians. And they've been proved because they have continued with the proxy war. Then we saw Operation Sindoor happened. And in Operation Sindoor, for the first time, we saw that what I call the one front integrated war, where the PLA supported the Pakistan military to the hilt with its non-kinetic capabilities, other capabilities, without showing the hand. So we saw that. And immediately what the Pakistanis have done is, after Sindoor, they have taken one big structural reform. And this is where I say this has happened because of their close interaction with the PLA. What they have done is that they have raised a Army Rocket Force Command, a rocket force command under the Pakistan Army. And I said, when this was created, in fact, I did a video on that. I said, now the concept of operational level of war has come alive. It has been established in the Pakistan military for two reasons. One, we saw the performance of the Pakistan Air Force, where they displayed their multi-domain operations, which is at an operational level of war instead of doing dogfights. And now they created this, they raised this. So I said, both these entities, the Pakistan Air Force and the Pakistan Army Rocket Force Command, which will have their missiles, they'll be operating at the operational level of war. And that is the decisive level of war. And after a few weeks, in fact, after a few months, I heard an assessment or a lecture by one of their very prominent generals, Pakistan General, Lieutenant General Khalid Kidwai. Now, General Kidwai said very clearly that the Pakistan Army Rocket Force Command, it is creating a level between the conventional war and the nuclear war. And he said this army command will only have conventional missiles. So you see what I was talking about earlier, that you create a layer, you create a level in between, and that is the operational level of war. And that is so it has been, General Kidwai has confirmed that yes, this has been done. Now, along with that, we also know that they are looking at the possibility of having a deterrence, a sea-based deterrence. And we know that they have tested their SLBM Babar 3 And this was first tested in 2017, then it was tested in 2018, and now this is to be integrated with the Hangar submarines that they are getting from China. So they have done the test, but this is a test of what? This is the test of the, not a nuclear test has been done here. It is the test of Babar 3, a missile, which will carry the nuclear warhead. Similarly, what the Russians have done and similarly what the Chinese have done. Nobody in my assessment has done the testing. But coming back to Pakistan, there is another reason. After Sindoor, as far as the world is concerned, they have assessed that the Pakistan military gave a good performance, and based on that, the geopolitical profile of Pakistan has risen substantially. So the point to make is, when China will support Pakistan to the hilt whenever Sindhu 2 happens, because China has consistently maintained that we will support the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Pakistan, which means as far as Pakistan is concerned in the conventional capabilities, I want the Indian side to think they will actually be more than a match with help from China against the Indian military. So they have no need really to do any further testing. Why should they do a nuclear testing? It doesn't make sense. And moreover, why must they jeopardize their risen geopolitical status by doing a nuclear test? And the Chinese will be unhappy, the Russians will be unhappy, and the Americans will be unhappy. And today, all the three great powers, they have good relations. Pakistan has good relations with all of the three. It will not jeopardize all this. Now to coming back to the Trump point. So the point is, why has Trump spoken like this about nuclear testing? Now, you see, when he was talking this to the media about the testing in a very roundabout way, as far as his energy secretary is concerned, Chris Wright, he said very clearly that what has been ordered by President Trump is the system testing. That is what has been ordered. Nothing more than that. That means they want to work on their certain systems, the delivery systems, the propulsion systems. That has what been ordered. So why did Trump say all this? In my assessment, I can only think of one reason why he said that is because he is now interacting in his foreign policy with the other two great powers directly, which is China and Russia. He perhaps wanted to send a message back home to his domestic audience that, look, I am interacting with them from a position of strength by doing these testings, because they are also doing that testing, being ambiguous about what test is this. Is it a nuclear test or it is a systems test for the delivery of nuclear weapons? Now, in my next video, I will explain this concept further of operational level of war and how in the modern war it has changed, and why it is very important that the Indian military understand this operational level of war thoroughly. Thank you so much.